Next, we're going to talk about account protection. This is an interesting one, and I think as we go through some of this, we're going to be throwing out some controversial concepts. So I'm not promoting or not promoting these concepts. I just want to throw them out there. So password practices. Common password policy. This is every organization I've ever worked in, and most likely is how you guys manage passwords or something very similar, which is we require complex passwords. We require users to change those passwords every 30, 60, 90 days, whatever your policy is. We say you can't use the previous 5 is generally an average. So now as an end user, I've got to make up 6 passwords that I'm going to use in a rotation, right? If I want my credentials to be cached in that scenario, I have to change my password while I'm on the corporate network. Otherwise, I get out of sync, and now I'm logging into Outlook with a different password than I am into Windows, and that's always a fun challenge. And lastly, a lot of this leads to people writing their password rotation down on a Post-it note and sticking it under their keyboard, or sometimes even as brazen as putting it right there on their monitor. So the moral of this process is we've, as IT, have been trying to see how can we try to mitigate people's passwords and accounts from being compromised. And really what we've done is we've created a scenario that's complex that can actually make it less secure for those very reasons where people are writing their passwords down and sticking them all over the place because they can't use a common passphrase that they know and they have to change it constantly. So it becomes a very complex. Now, so this guy could either be one of our end users, right? He's frustrated because, oh, it's time to change my password again. And he's going to try several things and not meet the complexity requirements for 3 or 4 tries, things like that. It's going to be very frustrated. That can also be an IT admin, right? Because we're getting the calls constantly in the service desks about passwords. Right? I would venture to say, at least in the organizations I've worked with, password reset requests make up the majority of the service desk calls. Right? So you've created what you think is a secure process, but it becomes very frustrating to an end user and for the IT department. So again, what is our impact? Well, frustrated users generally translates into Post-it notes. Having a password in general, right, is subject to somebody's shoulder surfing you and taking your password from that and going to another machine in your network and logging in as you. With this general traditional way of managing accounts and passwords, we don't really have a way to alert on my account was just logged in Vietnam for some reason, right? That's suspicious. I'm not in Vietnam. Phishing attacks. This is a very prominent way this day and age to get users to expose their account, right? People are getting very good at crafting these phishing emails that look very legitimate and convincing people to click in and put their information in, which is definitely a challenge. And then of course we have the good old brute force attacks, right? If somebody knows your ID, they can try to go down the path of brute force cracking your password. So optimization, we're going to talk about a couple of different things here, but I think one of the very first lines of defense is multi-factor authentication. Almost every service I use now outside of work is 2-factor authentication enabled. Sometimes it's required, but many organizations are at least even offering it as an option to be more secure. Makes a lot of sense when you think about it, right? Because even if you have my username and password, if I've got to authenticate in a second factor, very little chance that you're going to be able to spoof that and crack my account. So specifically in multi-factor authentication, Azure MFA. So if you guys are licensed for enterprise mobility and security or Azure Active Directory Premium specifically, you own Azure MFA. That can be implemented in the cloud, it can be implemented on-prem, or it can be both. It can do more than just login, Windows login multi-factor authentication. It can secure other services and stuff on-prem with 2-factor authentication. Is anybody using Azure MFA today? So we got 4. Cool. That's good. And your experience so far?
Great.
You're eyeballing me.
Where's mine online?
Okay. Yeah, we'll read between the lines on that one. Thank you.
Conditional access.
Which is the next bullet point, conditional access, right? So you can also use conditional access to enforce MFA enrollment as well as a number of other things that we'll touch on briefly a little bit later. The ability to monitor and audit suspicious logins is critical this day and age. Right? So I've had a password of mine, an account of mine that recently got compromised from some data breach. And almost every service I use that account on, I started getting email notifications, right? I got an Uber notification, somebody logged in Vietnam on my Uber account, right? That sort of thing. Being able to do that and be able to see that in your login process is very key to understanding how your accounts are being used, right? So MFA gives you another level of protection there in that process. So here's where we're going to talk a little bit about the controversial discussion that's being had in many circles. So rethinking password policies. When I talked about the standard password complexity requirements, reuse, unable to reuse, change every so often, is that how you guys are all set up in your organizations today? Pretty common, right? So I'm going to put up a quote here. This is from, let me scroll down to get this guy's name. So Aaron Margosis, he's a principal consultant in the Microsoft public sector that specializes in Windows platforms, focus on security, least privilege, and compatibility in lockdown environments. So I'll let you read the quote, but in effect, it's, if we're taking the modern approach to account management, right, we're doing things like blocking known bad IP ranges. We're implementing multi-factor authentication, right? And then in the next bullet, we're going to talk about Windows Hello. If we take all of that and we combine that, really what value are we gaining out of users having to change their password all the time? And hopefully the next slide will kind of lead into some of the reason behind that. So Windows Hello. Is anybody using Windows Hello today in their organizations for their end users? No one. Wow. Okay. Well, hopefully we're going to talk a little bit about today, at least maybe spark your ability to go back and see, is Windows Hello something that you guys want to implement in your organization? There's a lot of really good features about this, right? So Windows Hello, if you're not familiar, is native to Windows 10, uses the PIN or biometric login process instead of your traditional username and password. Now, you still have a password, right? But when you actually go to log in, you're going to use either the biometrics or the PIN, so your password is not transmitted across the wire. That biometric fingerprint or facial recognition or your PIN code that you create for that login process is tied specifically to that device. Right? I can't take somebody's PIN and go to any other device in my organization and log in. We can integrate Windows Hello with multi-factor authentication as well. Right? So we kind of have a two-factor authentication there where we have an account, and now we have a fingerprint or a facial recognition or a PIN as a second level of authentication, but we can add MFA on top of that as well to make it even more secure. So let's talk a little bit about why would I want to use PINs and why would I want to use Windows Hello. So Windows Hello effectively addresses the following password problems that we see. One, strong passwords, difficult to remember, translates into post-it notes. Somebody breaches the server, right? It can expose those network credentials. In a traditional login process, your password is transmitted to the authentication server over the wire. So it's subject to somebody internal on your network sniffing the wire and trying to take your password. In a Windows Hello scenario, your PIN is local to the device. It's not transmitted anywhere, right? When a PIN is created, it establishes a trust relationship with the identity provider, creates an asymmetric key pair, and is used for authentication. So when you log in with your PIN or your biometrics, it actually just unlocks the authentication key to sign the request, and that's what's sent to the authentication server, right? So you're protecting your username and password on that device because you're never sending it across the wire for authentication. Significant increase in security in that manner, right? So not only do you get better security, but now you've also got a very friendly login process, right? So if I've got all of this stuff in play, you gotta start thinking or asking yourself, do I need all those complex password requirements if I've put all of this stuff in front of it? So end users, right? So I use Windows Hello, and I couldn't imagine having to go back because it's just so convenient. I can put my finger on the fingerprint reader and instantly log in. So highly encourage you guys to read up on Windows Hello and see how and where it can fit in your organization, because it is really powerful stuff when properly implemented and can really make your end users experience much better and maybe get out of the business of keeping post-it notes to log in. Did you have a question?
Yeah, does that completely get around past cache because you're not actually transmitting anything?
Correct. If somebody already has it, right, then and they're taking your authentication from a server they've compromised, that doesn't get around that, right? But purely the login process into your device prevents your password from being transmitted over the wire to the authentication server, right? So it's tied to the device itself. So I don't have to change my password because I'm not using my password to log in, right? My password is what it is. I'm using Windows Hello and my PIN and biometrics to do my login.
Right, so it's signing something and then sending that.
Yeah, but even
Correct.
if you took those credentials to another device, it's not gonna authenticate you to that device, right? Because it's on the VPN chip of it.
Right, so think about it, I still have a username and password. If somebody's still got a hold of my username and password, I've got MFA requirements on, or I've got Windows Hello requirements turned on in my group policy. I go sit down to another machine, it's gonna try to force me to enroll, and it's gonna make me use my MFA to do that login. Right, so with Azure MFA specifically, I have the ability to go report on failed login attempts and things like that, right? I can see if somebody's taken my user account and trying to log into other devices with it unsuccessfully. So really, really powerful stuff that a lot of people are not using because I think there's a lot of, at least from the various organizations I've talked to, there's a lot of confusion around the security process here, right? People are like, well, why do I want to use a PIN? Somebody can guess a PIN, right? If I'm doing a 4-digit PIN, that doesn't sound more secure to me. But when you think about the whole process and how it works together, it is actually a very, very secure process. Specifically because I can't take that PIN, even if somebody grabbed it, and go to any other device. They would have to steal my device. They would have to use my PIN code to log in, and then they would have to get multi-factor authentication request to commit that, right? So very powerful stuff. So definitely encourage everybody to start really looking into that. The controversy is you're going to go to your security team and say, hey, we want to remove all of our password policies. They're probably going to flip their lid immediately until you maybe start having a deeper conversation about it.
Can you really remove all your password policies? Because if you have a new device,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to set up the connection, say, between my new Outlook client and the Exchange server, wherever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to do the same thing for OneDrive, and et cetera, et cetera. So at some point, I'm typing in I have to have a password to establish that connection.
When you
Or-
log into
or
your
I have
device.
a device and I'm just going to use some strange browser.
Yeah, the first time you log into your device, right, you're going to have to use your password to log in because that's the only thing it knows at that point. But you can use group policy to say on login and force Windows Hello enrollment, basically, right? Force a PIN creation. If it's biometrics, you can force that. From that point on, right, that credential never leaves your device.
Right. So you still have a little hole there that one time set up for a device or something.
Yeah.
Somebody else got your password, they can set up their device, their burner phone or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. All right, any other questions around Windows Hello?